Hey, I'm strummerdood or mad or whatever. I don't know. So anyone familiar with the Metal Gear series knows its creator Hideo Kojima entrenches the narrative and the history of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, primarily due to the advent of nuclear weapons during World War II. But with this final entry into the series, Kojima takes this most extensive look at the effects of the Cold War on modern history through the origins of Big Boss's military empire, and it has a lot to do with the concept of phantom pain. The central conflict at the heart of the Metal Gear series between Major Zero and Snake can very easily serve as a metaphor for the Soviet Union and the United States. After the events of Metal Gear Solid 3, in which a legendary American soldier named the Boss dies at the hands of Snake to prevent a nuclear holocaust, Zero and Snake take steps to fulfill the Boss's will, to see the world united. How they interpret the will and go about fulfilling it divides them. Zero views the world as a stage and creates the Patriots, a secret society who will orchestrate world events from afar. Disgusted by Zero, Snake establishes a private army to fight conflicts throughout the world. His interpretation of the Boss's will: an army without borders and refuge for disenfranchised soldiers. The conflict intertwines with actual history, as plainly illustrated by post-game listings of ancillary events. During the Cold War, both the Americans and Soviets framed the conflict as a battle between two ideologies: capitalism and communism. After World War II, the United States provided aid to ravaged European countries and Japan. The Soviets saw this as a means to exert capitalist influence on the global stage, and they weren't really wrong. Meanwhile, Russia annexed countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and imposed the limits to their now communist governments. These countries came to be known as satellite states, and America feared the Soviet Union under the brutal Joseph Stalin had aspirations to be another empire in the vein of Adolf Hitler's tyrannical Germany. And again, they weren't really wrong. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, takes place in the midst of the conflict between Big Boss and Major Zero, specifically after the Ground Zero event at Camp Omega perpetrated by Major Zero's military wing, Cypher. As noted by all those zeros, the event plants the initial seeds of ill content in Big Boss, referred to thereafter as the Phantom Pain, or the residual effects of war. After waking from a 9-year coma following the destruction of his private army, MSF, Snake not only feels the physical loss of an appendage, but the spiritual loss of his comrades, impelling him into a revenge campaign against the man responsible for the attack, Skullface. Skullface also suffers from his own phantom pain, beset upon him as a child growing up in Hungary during the Nazi occupation in World War II. When the Allies bombed a weapons factory in his village, Skullface suffered grave injuries, resulting in severe scarring. With the subsequent Cold War, the Soviet Union took the place of the Germans as an occupying force, imposing their government and culture on the Hungarians. Especially under Stalin, Hungarians were repressed, and rebellions like Budapest in 1956 were violently crushed. Due to extensive nerve damage, Skullface can no longer feel physical pain, but still feels the spiritual pain of these foreign incursions, including the compulsory use of his occupier's language instead of his native tongue. To alleviate his phantom pain, Skullface plans to use vocal cord parasites to erase certain languages from existence. Though the Metal Gear lore establishes the parasites as essential to evolution, the character Code Talker reverse engineers them to effectively devolve lingua franca, or adopted language. Language imperialism actually existed to assert dominance over a culture. A form of such control shows up in George Orwell's 1984, a novel referenced frequently in The Phantom Pain. The authoritarian government creates newspeak, which eliminates inflammatory words of disapproval so as to remove the very idea of rebellion. In a sense, Skullface wants to reset the imperialistic influence of foreign superpowers on smaller nations. He fittingly cultivates his parasites in a place greatly affected by such imperialistic ventures: Africa. Hideo Kojima said the parasites represent Western governments and corporations who prey on the host nations of Africa, and indeed the continent still reels from the phantom pain of colonial occupation. The scramble for Africa saw European powers divide the entire continent between arbitrary colonial lines, paying no mind to the indigenous tribes and their cultures. The oppressive conditions of the colonies, most infamously by the hand of King Leopold in the Congo, scarred the continent for generations. When decolonization occurred midway through the 20th century, the population was ill-equipped to govern because the colonial powers designed the infrastructure of these countries solely around extracting natural resources as opposed to actually providing providing education and healthcare to its citizens. The inbred problems were only exacerbated when nations like Belgium classified tribes differently in society, like placing the Tutsis in government positions over the Hutus in Rwanda. It eventually led to a genocide in which between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsis were killed. Now, not only does Skullface want to reverse the effects of imperialism through language, but he also wants to strip away the ability of superpower nations to militarily strong-arm smaller nations. He plans to do so by making nuclear weapons easily accessible across the globe, in a sense, making the world equal, separate, and peaceful via the universal language of nuclear deterrence. The idea of discouraging nuclear attacks by guaranteeing an equivalent retaliation. Skullface's schemes very obviously call out the geopolitical maneuverings of the Americans and Soviets during the Cold War. In 1947, American diplomat George F. Kennan, under the pseudonym Mr. X, published an article promoting containment of Soviet expansionism under Joseph Stalin. Inspired by the article, President Harry S. Truman created the Truman Doctrine, vowing to contain the influential reach of the Soviets by curbing their communist ideology. Both nations maintained a stark us versus them mentality when dealing with other countries. Either you were a capitalist or a communist, no in between. As Big Boss notes at the beginning of Metal Gear Solid 3, this ideological division saw the world fractured into two parts, East and West. But unlike most wars, the US and Soviets never really engaged in direct combat with each other in fear of nuclear holocaust. So instead, they both look to combat these ideologies via proxy. The Phantom Pain takes place in two Cold War hotspots during the 80s, both of which exemplify foreign policy during this period. Afghanistan during the Soviets' 9-year war in the region, and the Angola-Zaire border during many of the South and Central African civil wars. How America dealt with Zaire, better known today as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, follows a pattern of covert operations by the CIA to deal with Soviet influence. Again, fearing the spread of communism, the CIA reacted decisively to any hint of socialism in the form of regime changes. In 1954, America deposed Guatemala's democratically elected president after he instituted socialist programs ironically influenced by US President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. In Chile, the CIA spread false propaganda to fan the flames of rebellion against their elected socialist president. Once a tentpole for progressivism and democracy in South America, Chile became a military dictatorship on September 11, 1973, when thousands were slaughtered and tortured following the coup. Remember the Sandinistas from Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker? They overthrew their dictator in Nicaragua, but because of their socialist programs, Ronald Reagan illegally supplied rebels known as Contras who destabilized the government by attacking schools and hospitals and murdering, torturing, and raping citizens. Now in the Congo, after struggling for its independence from Belgium in 1960, the citizens democratically elected Patrice Lumumba. But when Belgium and its mining companies sowed the seeds of discontent in the country's southern province and the UN failed to react, Lumumba asked for help from the Soviets. America saw red and provided money and weapons to remove him from power. The assassination of Lumumba led to the rise of Joseph Mobutu, a military colonel turned authoritarian president who filled his own pockets through cronyism, plunging the economy into billions of dollars in debt. America was cool with him though, since he was anti-communist. When they received the mineral cobalt for fighter jets, So even though America didn't colonize these countries, they did violate their sovereignty and manufacture their culture for their own political and economic gain. And like colonization, the nations remain scarred by the frequent regime changes over to dictators. How Skullface and Venom Snake go about their operations in Africa illustrate their willingness to harvest the continent of its own fruits to further their conflict against one another. Skullface houses his parasite operation at the Devil's House, where rows upon rows of African children are subjected to immoral tests, mirroring Nazi experiments during the Holocaust. And Venom Snake and his Diamond Dogs, while certainly benefiting by playing both sides of the Cold War through military contracts, also extract an exorbitant amount of valuable natural resources. And I mean, you aren't exactly funneling that back into Africa. You're stealing it and using it to buy more weapons. The Phantom Pain's other examination of Cold War foreign policy focuses on proxy wars, an oft-forgotten example being the Korean War in 1953. While the Allies battled Japan during World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States took control of North Korea and South Korea respectively. After the Pacific War, Stalin installed Kim Il-sung, supplied him with weapons, and pushed for him to invade South Korea in order to extend his communist empire.
Fearing communism would spread to Japan, America responded with ground troops, and though the South made early grounds, the introduction of China into the fray led to a stalemate. While America's intervention into the war eventually led to South Korea's rise as a major economic power while being one of our closest allies, the Soviets left a disciple of Stalin in charge of North Korea, and what we have now is a multi-generational nightmare with no good solution available. Now on the southern border of Zaire is Angola, which went through a messy, multi-sided 26-year civil war after decolonizing from Portugal. The war was mainly fought between two liberation groups, the National Union for Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, and the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA. Both naturally show up in Metal Gear Solid 5. Savvy to the goings-on of the Cold War, both sides arbitrarily adopted an ideology to garner support from foreign countries, the MPLA affiliating with the Marxist ideals of pro-Soviet Cuba, and UNITA associating with the anti-communist ideals of America. Now again, it's a duel between ideologies, but more specifically, it's about securing Angola's vast amounts of petroleum and keeping it out of the hands of the Soviets. The protracted war internally displaced thousands, and the political climate remains extremely divided.
An endless seesaw of blood and violence played out in the hands of the superpowers.
So let's move on to something simpler, the Middle East.
Phantom Pain also takes place in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War. Generations of foreign incursions led Afghanistan towards isolationist tendencies and drove devotion towards traditional ways of life. Each ensuing invasion, whether during the 19th century Great Game when the Russian and British empires jockeyed for regional superiority in Central Asia, or during the Cold War, simply slowed progress being made. After the Saur Revolution in 1978, America lost a strategic foothold in the region to the communists. But in 1979, when Afghanistan's pro-Soviet government lost a significant amount of control over their largely Islamic population, the Soviet Union invaded to quell rebellion. Tensions only grew, and shortly after the Soviets invaded, the United States began supplying weapons to rebel fighters called the Mujahideen, including Stinger missiles for use against gunships, which Venom Snake consequently seeks out in the mountains of Afghanistan. Pakistan served as an intermediary for the CIA. They both tended to fund militant Islamists like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who held close ties to Osama bin Laden and his group Al-Qaeda, as opposed to more moderate fighters like Ahmad Shah Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, a group which later served as a key American ally during the war in Afghanistan. The Soviets found themselves in a quagmire, and 4 years after withdrawing troops in 1987, the Soviet Union dissolved. The cost of America's victory was staggering. Over 800,000 civilians were killed, the country's crucial agriculture was ravaged by bombings, a third of the population was displaced to Pakistan and Iran, and though they spent billions on military assistance, America refused to invest in infrastructure like schools. Also, the land was now ripe with millions of Soviet butterfly mines, which still kill and disable children every day, and have led to over 100,000 amputees in the country. Now, to relay the residual effects of being a proxy for a higher power, Kojima goes a step further than simply referencing the past. With the story's final twist, Kojima personalizes the experience of Phantom Pain. After taking down Skullface, we learn Venom Snake is not actually Big Boss, but instead the MSF medic on the helicopter shot down by Skullface in Ground Zeroes. Hoping to take out the rogue Skullface, Major Zero had the medic's appearance surgically altered, allowing the real Big Boss to operate outside the public eye as the newly christened Venom Snake took on Skullface. Big Boss simply uses Venom Snake as a proxy tool in the same way the United States and Soviet Union use proxy wars to advance their own political goals. Venom becomes an inanimate marionette, driven home by his prosthetic limb, and the fact that the cure for the vocal cord parasite leaves the victim infertile. The medic loses his identity, forced to carry on the legacy of Big Boss instead of his own. Big Boss frames it as a happy ending, but in Metal Gear Solid 4, as an older, more enlightened man, he laments his and Zero's distortion of the boss's will, concluding she simply wanted the world to be. Similarly, George Kennan felt others misinterpreted his containment article as a unilateral military concept, as opposed to a measured political or economic policy. Kennan never regarded the Soviets as a military threat akin to Hitler, but felt his article led Washington to assert as much to the American public, allowing the country to pursue armed conflict during the Cold War. With their warped ideologies, Major Zero and Big Boss joined the men who sold the world and robbed people like Solid Snake of their free will. As he says,
"The world would be better off without snakes."
The term snake here means political tool for people like Big Boss and Zero, and indeed, Venom's snake joins a long lineage of snakes being double-crossed by political and third-party organizations. In the original, Big Boss sends Solid Snake into outer heaven, intending for him to be killed during the operation. In Metal Gear Solid, not only does Liquid Snake trick his brother Solid Snake into activating Metal Gear Rex, but the Pentagon infects Solid Snake with the Foxdie virus in order to kill off the terrorists at Shadow Moses and allow the US to retrieve Rex undamaged. In Metal Gear Solid 2, Raiden, codenamed Snake, finds himself in a simulation of the Shadow Moses incident in order to test how human behavior can be manipulated. And in Metal Gear Solid 3, the boss strings along Snake and allows herself to be killed as a traitor in order to prove the US's innocence of a nuclear explosion in Russia. Additionally, in Metal Gear Solid 4, Liquid Ocelot uses nanomachines to control genome soldiers like puppets. And a precursor of the technology exists in the Phantom Pain through the parasitic skulls. In a sense, Venom has a lot in common with Psycho Mantis in the Phantom Pain, a conduit for the player's rage. In fact, Kojima always regarded Snake as a conduit for the player, and in the Phantom Pain, he makes his most concerted effort with a near-silent protagonist and the expanded freedom afforded during missions. In Metal Gear Solid 4, Big Boss looks back at his past actions and figures if Solid Snake was in his shoes in the past, he may not have made the same mistakes. Except here's the thing, we, the player, were in Big Boss's and Venom's shoes, and we still made the same mistakes of buying into a false perception. In a way, the player is Big Boss, because like him, we control Venom Snake like a puppet. He is our proxy, someone who acts on our behalf, and therefore represents us. Throughout the Cold War, America funded authoritarian regimes in fear of the Soviet Union, and to the people who suffered at the hands of these dictators, these governments represented America. In 1953, when Iran's prime minister nationalized their massive oil industry because the precursor to British petroleum were retaining 85% of the profits, America ousted the democratically elected leader in a coup d'etat and replaced him with a pro-Western monarch, who let us control shares of their oil wealth instead of the Soviets. But like the concept of Phantom Pain explored in Metal Gear Solid 5, such brazen foreign incursions incensed Iranians against the West, leading to extensive residual effects on the entirety of the Middle East, which Kojima explored further in Metal Gear Solid 4. In retaliation to the westernization of the country, Iranians ousted the pro-America Shah in 1979 and instituted an authoritarian theocracy. President Jimmy Carter granted the overthrown Shah asylum in America despite Iranians demanding he be brought to a trial and executed. So in retaliation to that, supporters of the revolution stormed the American embassy in Iran and took 52 Americans hostage. So in retaliation to that, America spent billions of dollars to arm and fund Iraq's brand new president and our proxy, Saddam Hussein, in his devastating war against Iran. Saddam infamously used chemical weapons procured from Western powers to devastating effect against Iran. Over 100,000 civilians died on each side, and Saddam later led a genocidal campaign against Iraqi Kurds. Retaliation clouded our judgment and led us to being represented by a ruthless dictator with a genocidal bent. And like much of America's foreign policy during the Cold War, allying with Saddam led to lingering consequences after the Cold War. With Iraq heavily in debt to Kuwait, and America sending mixed signals on the disagreement, Saddam annexed the country in 1991, resulting in the Gulf War between Iraq and America. The US successfully completed their mission in removing Saddam from Kuwait, but stopped short of invading Baghdad to remove Saddam from power because of a potential power vacuum. Still, throughout the 90s, there was a push to remove the problematic dictator, like the Project for the New American Century, a political think tank endorsed by future Bush Jr. cabinet members Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. With the Phantom Pain, Kojima seems to be asking the question, what lengths are we willing to go for revenge? Along with hypnotherapy, Big Boss, Miller, and Ocelot prey on Venom's Phantom Pain to coerce him to do their bidding, creating a reality for him to exist in and compelling him to exact vengeance against Skullface, who at one point was a proxy himself. In typical Metal Gear fashion, they're basically putting you in a video game where they wrap you up in a scenario and give you explicit instructions on how to walk.
Time to walk. Press the stance button to stand up.
And preface every mission with a credit sequence. After the Cold War, foreign policy suddenly became very murky. We no longer had a big bad bear to take down, and international operations could no longer stand on the merit of stopping Russia from building a communist empire. The then President George Bush Sr. declared a new world order, not the conspiracy theory, defining the post-Cold War era as unstable and uncertain, requiring America to translate the practices of containing the Soviet Union to oppression across the globe. Massive failures like Somalia shook the philosophy to its core, as well as our passivity to the Rwanda genocide. But with the September 11th attacks on New York City came a revitalization of the New World Order through the War on Terror. Because the Afghanistan government sheltered the guilty party, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, America invaded and swiftly took control of the country. But as we were building a Marshall Plan for the restructuring of Afghanistan, the Bush administration looked to defeat other regimes. During his 2002 State of the Union address, Bush grouped countries like Iran and Iraq into the overly simplistic axis of evil, which is strange given Iran was actively helping us in Afghanistan but suddenly dropped support when labeled terrorists. Now, the Iranian government are guilty of human rights abuses against their people, and they funded militias during the War on Terror. On the flip side, America forego diplomatic dialogue with Iran throughout the early 2000s. In 2002, Karl Rove, an advisor to Bush Jr., told a New York Times reporter we no longer live in a reality-based world. Instead, America as an empire creates a reality, and those who rely on empirical data will be left to study this new reality. Which is something you probably don't want to tell a New York Times reporter. A year later, America invaded Iraq on the claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, that he purchased yellow cake in Niger, and that he harbored members of Al-Qaeda, effectively putting him under the umbrella of terrorists. In regards to the uranium purchase, career Foreign Ambassador Joseph C. Wilson was sent to Niger to investigate claims that Saddam bought yellow cake, but his analysis proved them to be unfounded. Now, with a very damning accusation linking Saddam and Al-Qaeda, the CIA and independent panels never actually found evidence of said relationship. Finally, Hans Blix, the lead weapons inspector for the UN, reported no findings of WMDs in Iraq and stated the full process would be resolved in mere months as the country was cooperating. Bush's administration countered, saying diplomacy had failed and launched their invasion a few days later. As we now know, no weapons of mass destruction were actually found. Only caches of chemical weapons like sarin and mustard gas obtained from before 1991. According to the New York Times, the US government falsely reported the discoveries as brand new chemical rounds used by Saddam, not only to detract from their mistaken intelligence, but so as not to reveal the munitions were created by Western governments and companies. A leaked memo belonging to former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair's foreign policy advisor details a meeting between Blair and Bush 2 months before the invasion. Not only did they agree to invade regardless of whether or not the UN inspectors found weapons of mass destruction, their first go-around proving fruitless, but Bush also suggested painting a U-2 spy plane in UN colors and flying it in Iraq airspace in order to provoke Saddam into shooting it down, giving precedence for invasion. Sort of like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a falsely reported sea battle between America and the Vietnamese, which allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to escalate the war in Vietnam. Playing on people's fears, driving a means to retaliate, creating a big bad boss to take down with the axis of evil, it spawned a false reality. It skewed our perception like the fear of communism during the Cold War. In The Phantom Pain, almost immediately, Kojima draws parallels with the novel Moby Dick.
As of today, your name is Ahab.
You can call me Ishmael.
In the story, Captain Ahab seeks revenge against the eponymous white whale. Perception and how we discern empirical evidence lies at the center of the novel. Ahab sees Moby Dick as evil incarnate, but the character Ishmael derives no meaning from the whale as its nature remains a mystery. Like Ahab, Venom Stink's perception may be clouded by revenge.
One of the more unsettling or infuriating aspects of the ending is this idea that what we perceive may be misleading.
Before these revelations, we're presented with this Nietzsche quote about perception. We then replay the first mission of the game, in which we're told a piece of shrapnel is embedded within our cerebral cortex, the center for memory, perception, language, and consciousness. Only there's a few key differences which help illuminate the truth of the event. As Venom looks into a mirror, his true face staring back at him, Big Boss tells him to be proud of our actions. We then see a bloodied Venom snake staring back at us, the shrapnel in his head risen to a full horn. On the door behind him, instead of the diamond dog symbol, we see the ominous logo for Big Boss's ruthless outer heaven. The marketing for Metal Gear Solid 5 purported we would see the transformation of Big Boss into the cruel warlord Solid Snake confronts in the original Metal Gear. The trailers insinuate Big Boss slaughters children and soldiers as he becomes indistinguishable from Skullface, but most of these crimes come off instead as misunderstandings. Venom Snake doesn't shoot child soldiers, but instead shoots a bucket, and tries to rehabilitate the children back into society. He doesn't store the Metal Gear Sahelanthropus for the purposes of owning a nuke, but instead as a trophy for his men. Speaking of men, the soldiers he massacres at Mother Base willingly accepted death as they were infected with the vocal cord parasites. This begs a few questions. Are we too biased to see our true actions and the effects therein? Or does public perception betray the true story of Venom Snake? On one hand, Ocelot takes time to discuss the false stories attributed to his meme Shalshaska. On the other, we have the compulsive liar Huey Emmerich proclaiming the soldiers are blind to their actions, criticizing their inability to recognize D-Dog as a wolf. Well, maybe it's a combination of both. Skullface was surely a threat, but did it necessitate torturing your own men, playing both sides of a proxy war, indiscriminately sending your men to die for resources? To the player, we can see the unforeseen mistakes made during the conflict and forgive Venom Snake. But to the public, the ones who don't even know the truth of the Ground Zero event, Venom's crimes play out like Kojima's trailer. As in war, there is no good and bad in the Phantom Pain, only various shades of gray. Different perspectives and points of view depending on who you ask. There is no objective truth here. Near the end of Chapter 1, Skullface compares himself to Venom Snake.
We both are demons.
And when you first hear this, you may think it's absurd. But after seeing the ending, you gotta wonder if there's some truth to it. We can find some more clues in Skullface's original name, Scarface, which is likely a reference to the eponymous 1983 film. Scarface tells the story of Tony Montana, a Cuban immigrant whose American dream necessitates selling copious amounts of coke. During his fall from the top, he gives a speech to Miami's richest citizens, accusing them of being just as despicable as him, only they hide behind a mask. After the Gulf War, America imposed economic sanctions against Iraq. The banning of all trade and financial resources, as well as imposing a no-fly zone, were meant to keep Saddam in a box, according to the Clinton administration. Suddenly, a secular and comparatively modern country in the Middle East couldn't even acquire chlorine to clean its water. The sanctions were linked to a sharp rise in infant mortality rates, and by 1999, UNICEF estimated around 500,000 children had died.
I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
One of the purported purposes of the sanctions was to incense the Iraqi population to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but the dictator actually used the sanctions to his benefit, appearing as benevolent compared to the Americans. Mind you, he did this while systematically killing Kurds in northern Iraq, but still, economic warfare effectively slaughtered the Iraq population, leading to Dennis Halliday, the UN humanitarian coordinator in Baghdad, to resign in 1999, stating he didn't want to, quote, administer a program that satisfies the definition of genocide. America tried to punish Saddam, but instead punished the civilians. In addition, President Bill Clinton launched missile strikes on Iraq throughout the 90s. Specifically, the 1998 Operation Desert Fox bombings were meant to target supposed weapon development facilities, but Iraq were cooperating with UN inspectors, and many of the bombs posed no strategic purpose other than to destabilize the area, resulting in dozens of civilians killed due to the airstrikes. The subsequent rushed invasion and occupation in 2003 led to more disasters. For example, the Abu Ghraib prison was once a house of horrors when controlled by Saddam's government, but not much changed when the Americans rolled in. Some soldiers and private military members used the facility to torture Iraqis. Shades of it appear in Ground Zero's version of Guantanamo Bay, which in itself is a whole other mess since we hold and torture prisoners without charge on Cuban soil. Later, in 2005, 24 Haditha civilians, some of which were children, were allegedly executed by Marines in retaliation for a soldier being killed by an IED. None of them received jail time, which outraged the Iraqis, a lawyer representing the victims stating, quote, "This is an assault on humanity." Similarly, the Blackwater private military firm killed 17 Iraqis in Baghdad. The vast majority of Marines were making the best of a messy, terrible situation with no long-term plan from their leaders. I mean, suddenly out of the blue, they have to rebuild a society's infrastructure, and things like this don't help them gain the favor of the Iraqis. These failures also undermined our mission in Afghanistan, funneling out money and troops as the Marshall Plan deflated and our American-style government clashed with Afghan values, fueling a resurgence of terror activities in the country. The crimes of our proxy may have been more apparent to the rest of the world, but for the Iraqi civilians, America and Saddam were two sides of the same coin. In seeking to alleviate our phantom pain, we only spread more seeds of discontent. Consequently, many of Metal Gear Solid 5's characters carry on burdens of living in the conditions of warfare. Born into the dire circumstances of Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, Psycho Mantis experienced abuse from his father. In Ground Zeroes, both Chico and Paz are tortured and raped by Skullface. Kaz is the son of an American soldier and a Japanese prostitute during World War II, his father being absent for most of his life. Child soldiers become a factor in Africa, and of course, Skullface resents his childhood under different foreign occupational regimes. Then you have Eli, the illegitimate clone of Big Boss. In particular, he seems like an allusion to children conceived during the Vietnam War. Quick primer on that one. America backed France in trying to continue their colonial rule of Vietnam because North Vietnamese Prime Minister Ho Chi Minh intended to unite the country under communist rule. Not content on losing Southeast Asia to communism, America found itself in a costly quagmire against Soviet-backed Vietnamese and Chinese forces. Now, during this 19-year war, many children were conceived between South Vietnamese women and US soldiers. These aberrations considered themselves cursed by their genes as neither country wanted them and instead shunned them from society. A sentiment echoed by Liquid, Solid, and Raiden throughout the series, and a shared experience with Kaz in his childhood. Like the other children in Metal Gear Solid 5, Eli carries the resentment of growing up in warfare for the rest of his life, eventually becoming Liquid Snake, one of the series' main antagonists. During the Phantom Pain, he steals Sahelanthropus from Venom Snake with his band of child soldiers. In a now infamous deleted mission, Venom pursues Eli to a remote island as he's infected with the English strain of the vocal cord parasite, and the whole nuclear mech thing too. Venom prevails and orders an aerial strike on the island, but Psycho Mantis saves Eli. The mission ends on a photo of two iconic New York City landmarks, the Statue of Liberty beckoning immigrants into the country, and the Twin Towers. Eli says,
"Not yet. It's not over yet."
So that's subtle. Now, he may be referring to the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, where Liquid crashes Arsenal gear into Manhattan, which was actually heavily edited due to 9/11 happening 2 months before the release of the game. This ending seems to explicitly allude to Eli perpetrating a terror attack on New York City. For Eli, the events of Phantom Pain are his ground zero event. Eli's origins and rise to power parallel militias and dictators that followed in the Cold War's wake, including a certain group in Afghanistan. When the Soviets abandoned the region, they left behind a vulnerable power vacuum. The different Mujahideen leaders like Ahmad Shah Massoud signed a power-sharing peace accord, with the exception being the main beneficiary of Pakistan and American aid, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who instead enacted a civil war on Pakistan's behalf by shelling the capital city of Kabul. Now, thousands of the refugee Afghani children in Pakistan were educated in politically religious schools, and by the time the civil war broke out in the 90s, a group of those children had grown up and formed Pakistan's latest proxy, the Taliban, who were characteristically ruthless, frequently massacring people to consolidate power. They also sheltered Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda as they planned their September 11th attacks. History repeated itself in Iraq when a power vacuum created with the removal of the secular Saddam allowed the Islamic State to seize a significant amount of control. Their leader, al-Baghdadi, actually spent time at an American prison in Iraq called Camp Bucca, where Red Cross estimates around 90% of the Iraqis were detained by mistake. With innocent civilians mixed in with militant leaders, Camp Bucca became a breeding ground for extremism, and many later went to serve leadership roles in ISIS. Additionally, the US funded a Sunni militia called the Sons of Iraq. America tasked the new Iraqi government and their US-picked Shiite leader to integrate them into the military and pay them. They didn't, and the thousands of fighters either became unemployed or joined the Islamic State. Many other ISIS soldiers were children during the Iraq War and have grown to resent the West, or they're simply living in a state of poverty and terror under ISIS. We created new enemies due to our reckless foreign policy, and then repeated history by using our Cold War answers to New World problems. It all gives a bit more clarity to why Kojima chose to end the series the way he did. Kojima's infamous for claiming each new Metal Gear will be the final installment in the series, so each entry ends with certainty, especially with Metal Gear Solid 4, where war subsides, and it appears Solid Snake will finally rest. The Guns of the Patriots links the Cold War and the War on Terror, but also ends on a poignant, if not pitiful, note. Old men engaged in one last conflict as their ways finally die with them, but ending with uncertainty. The Phantom Pain recognizes Snake will never rest so long as the player wants more. The death of Skullface feels unfulfilling, and according to Kojima, this was done to instill a sense of Phantom Pain into the player. A second chapter follows, and without a clear enemy or goal in mind, the game feels aimless and meandering. We just keep picking up contracts because that's what we do. We get money from conflicts. We're part of the military-industrial complex.
We need to expand our organization and get strong enough that no one can threaten us. So our only option is to fight and grow, and fight and grow.
At the very end of the Phantom Pain, we do receive a new mission, Operation Intrude N313, which entails the events of the original Metal Gear game on the MSX console. Big Boss sends Solid Snake, a product of the Zero and Boss conflict, on a suicide mission into Venom Snake's camp. We activate what appears to be an MSX console to access our next mission. as if we'll sit down and play the original Metal Gear right there. As players, we want another enemy, and as evidenced by the fact that we're playing a game in which the protagonist purportedly murdered children, we'll eat up anything so long as we play as Snake. The series will continue on without Kojima, existing as a phantom. When we meet Eli, a severed pig's head sits on a table in front of him, a reference to the novel Lord of the Flies, as is the title of the cut Mission 51, Kingdom of the Flies. Through the allegorical story of well-to-do British children being stranded on a deserted island, the novel explores the schism between ordered society and humanity's innate savagery. The Lord of the Flies, a literal translation of Beelzebub, is the name given to a severed pig's head stuck on a pike, which represents evil in the world. The character Jack begins dissenting from the group's leader, Ralph, by claiming to have seen a beast in the forest, stirring the children into a bloodlust, resulting in the accidental death of a child representing Jesus, and the intentional death of a child who believes in social conventions. Towards the end of the novel, Ralph strikes the Lord of the Flies in a fit of anger. The pig's smile only grows wider, showing not only the impossibility of snuffing out evil, but the manifestation of evil as a consequence to our violent retaliations. Violent action begets violent action, and as players, we don't know any different. We had one goal in mind and a clear enemy, but the game makes us question seemingly simple solutions to problems. It's no wonder Eli's jacket reads, "Never be game over." We'll never want the end of Metal Gear, and in reality, continuing to strike the pig's head with our stale Cold War policies won't stop the spread of evil.
So why are you here then? Why do you continue to follow your orders while your superiors betray you? Why did you come here? Well, I'll tell you then. You enjoy all the killing, that's why.
Hideo Kojima hasn't offered us an easy answer to foreign policy in the 21st century, but he does recognize the vicious feedback loop of the past century, and that something new needs to be instituted. In that sense, Quiet and Code Talker are just about the only heroes in this story. Code Talker resents American imperialism as a Navajo Native American, so much so as to create the vocal cord Parasite, but he reverses his hatred in order to help Diamond Dog stop the spread of the virus, and to enjoy American hamburgers. Quiet reverts her course for vengeance against Venom Snake. In her goodbye tape, she resents not being able to communicate with Venom, but we do see one form of effective communication: music through her humming. This is actually something Paz identified, music being a language without borders. And with the Phantom Pain's references to Lord of the Flies, 1984, David Bowie, Moby Dick, Godzilla, we see different cultures illustrating concerns shared between all peoples. Even without language, losing an ally like Quiet instills the greatest sense of phantom pain in the player. Robert McNamara, a former Secretary of State, said we must empathize with our attackers, know why they're fighting. He pointed to the Vietnam War. America thought it was about communism, but for the Vietnamese, it was about independence from colonial rule. Similarly, Skullface resents imperialism, and for good reason, but his means to end it certainly go too far. Big Boss starts his private army and proxy war to stop the spread of evil, but unfortunately, every action in geopolitics will lead to unforeseen consequences. Private armies become an epidemic in the Phantom Pain, and seemingly positive actions like ending the pollution of oil and drinking water often turn negative, opening villagers off to parasites. In the Cold War, the US went off the information available, and again, they did well in stopping Stalin during the Korean War, but then you have coups d'etats in Latin America which were obvious mistakes in retrospect. Looking at the Syria situation, negative unforeseen consequences will undoubtedly prop up, but hopefully the leaders in charge heed the past to avoid the same mistakes. At the very least, progress is being made in one area of concern. Means of communication seem to be opening somewhat between the US and Iran with a nuclear deal this year. And now with their cooperation with the deal, we've eased sanctions. This has culminated in a thankfully uneventful capture of American sailors who drifted into Iranian waters. Whereas before there'd be no direct communications and Iran would likely use the detainees as bargaining chips, Secretary of State John Kerry just made a few phone calls and the Americans were released. I think that'd make Kojima happy. There's still the disconcerting fact that billions of dollars in arms are being sold to Middle East countries to fuel proxy wars, America leading the pack in export sales worldwide, and the whole Russia annexing Crimea thing. But small steps. Metal Gear Solid 5 actually continues on with an experiment for its audience. If the global stockpile of nukes falls to zero, a hidden ending will unlock. But funnily enough, many are hoping it will unlock a whole new section of the game to play. You know, never be game over.